Hi everyone, good morning and thank you for joining us today. My name's Amy and I'm the Communications Manager here at MorePay. In today's webinar, we're going to be discussing the furlough scheme extension that was announced a few weeks ago. We've had many calls to our HR advice line on the implications of the extended scheme, and so we wanted to cover those FAQs on a webinar and also give attendees the chance to ask their own questions as well. So before we begin, there's just a few things to cover. So first of all, we've got about 350 people registered today. So we have got everyone's microphones muted just to keep things manageable and avoid any background noise. If you've got any technical difficulties with the webinar, just let us know by using the chat box in the GoToWebinar panel. And if it is something at our end, I will do my best to fix it. In preparation for today's live Q&A with our presenter and HR expert, Michelle, please post your questions in the question box throughout the webinar, and we'll answer as many of them as possible at the end of the presentation. After the webinar, we will send you a link to the recording on YouTube, and I'll share a copy of the slides as well. So don't worry if you can't take notes or if an Amazon delivery arrives and you need to go and answer the door. It's not a problem. We'll send everything to you. Finally, in terms of the structure of the webinar, I will just start by giving a quick overview of MorePay for those of you who maybe don't know us. I'll then pass you over to our host for today, Michelle, and after the main session, we'll come to the Q&A. So for those of you who don't know us, MorePay provide payroll and HR software as well as managed services or outsourced services to SMEs across the UK. We've been around for more than 50 years and we've got over 10,000 customers. Our promise is to make payroll and HR easy, and we do that by focusing on the delivery of 4 key things. So first of all is an easy switch to us with a simple onboarding service. Payroll and HR software that's easy to use but that has rich functionality, and flexible services delivered by a team of dedicated payroll and HR experts. If you would like more information about our software and our services, please drop me a note in the question box and I'll pick it up after the webinar. So moving on, I'd like to introduce your presenter today, Michelle. She is our HR Services Director. She joined MorePay in 2017 and is responsible for running all HR services activities within MorePay, including HR and employment law, and of course our consultancy services. Michelle has 15 years of both operational and strategic HR experience, and she is CIPD qualified. You can contact her via email, and you'll also find her on LinkedIn. I'll now hand over to Michelle, who will take you through our topic today, which is the furlough scheme and its extension and your HR FAQs.
Thank you very much, Amy. So if we just go on to the next slide, just want to remind you what the CJRS is. So the Coronavirus Job Retention Scheme Extension. So recently, the Job Support Scheme and Job Retention Bonus have been put on hold because of the changes that have happened in the government's approach to tackling coronavirus. And therefore, the CJRS has been extended now until March 2021. So the new policy details relating to this are about claims after the 1st of November 2020. And we know for a fact that all claims up to the 31st of January, the Job Retention Scheme will continue to pay 80% of furloughed employees' wages for the hour an employee is on furlough or not working, and this will be capped at 2,500 proportional to hours not worked. What we do know is that the government have said they are going to review towards the end of January 2021 and then announce what's going to happen in February and March. So we have a guarantee that there'll be some form of scheme available in February and March, but we do not have the detail. And the government are keeping that back to allow them to monitor the situation over the coming months. And there is a chance that they will ask employees to contribute more as they were doing sort of towards the end of the summer. So we will wait for details on that in the new year, but I think it's important that businesses know where they stand between now and the 31st of January. And obviously this has all come on the back of the rise in cases that led first of all to the tier system, then the national lockdown we're in, and the tier system that is going to be announced today. And we obviously know that this will likely continue in some form to the spring. So the government are laying out how they will be and continue to be supporting organisations. Other points to note are that employees are required to pay national insurance and pension contributions for the hour an employee is on furlough, and all claims need to be made by the 14th of the following month. So if it's a claim for November, it would have to be made by the 14th of December through the regular portal that you'll use. So as Amy said then, on our HR advice line, as you can imagine, we have seen an increasing number of queries relating to the extension of this scheme, what this means for organisations and how we can help them make the right decisions. There's a lot of information to take in, and our team of HR experts, which consists of HR advisors, advocates, employment law solicitors, HR consultants from a wide variety of backgrounds, and we use all that expertise to make sure that we keep up to date with this ever-changing world of employment law related to coronavirus. And we felt that it would be really useful to hold this webinar and talk you through some of the FAQs that we've been getting from our customers, and then talk you through the answers. So this is what this next section of slides will be about, our frequently asked questions to our advice line. So the first one that I've got here is about who is eligible for this extended scheme. So for this scheme then, an employee must have been on the PAYE payroll just before midnight on the 30th of October 2020. There is not a prerequisite that you have to have been furloughed before to use this extended scheme. If a business had managed up until now not to furlough employees, but now decides that it's the time to do it because this has gone on a lot longer than any of us ever anticipated, an employee would be entitled to be furloughed. Employees claim the grant for the hours their employees are not working. So obviously this is referring to flexible furlough, and this is calculated by reference to their usual working hours in any claim period. When claiming for the grant for the furloughed hours, employees need to report and claim from a minimum period of 7 consecutive calendar days. So this is similar to before, that you can't just furlough for a day and bring back in. But if you're doing a rota as part of flexible furloughing, that's fine. But any claim period needs to be for a period of 7 consecutive calendar days. And there's no gap in eligibility between October and November in terms of the schemes. So one of the other questions that we get is, can I still flexibly furlough an employee on the extended scheme? And the simple answer to that is yes. So the extended scheme will operate as before. And so this was towards the back end of the original scheme, with flexible furloughing being allowed in addition to full-time furloughing. So this gives businesses more options. So where there is some work for them to do, but not enough for a full-time job, you can flexible furlough them. An example might be a restaurant in an area that is under lockdown at the moment, which is the whole of the country. They may be full-time furloughing, but when the tier system is announced, they may be opening but not as many hours as they have done, or if they're in tier 3, they may only be operating as a takeaway or delivery service, and therefore you might want to consider the flexible furloughing where they are working some hours but not their regular hours. One thing you've got to remember, though, is that employers must agree these working arrangements with their staff. So this is going right back to everything that we said at the beginning of this scheme in March, that everything needs to be talked through and agreed in writing and documented. So one, you've got information regarding the employee and on their file to know what you talked about, when you talked about it, and what the outcome was, and also for HMRC records. You must make the required changes to the contract of employment, notifying them in writing, as I've just said, and it can also be made available to the HMRC as part of the reimbursement process. So if you were audited, write everything down. I would also advise you to seek advice from a HR professional, whether that's through ourselves or through internal teams, if there's anything that you're unsure about. So what extra rights does furlough give staff? Whilst there aren't specific changes that have happened in terms of the job retention scheme, and it doesn't make permanent changes to a contract. All the statutory rights remain as they were before. It is important to be aware of what an employee can or can't do whilst they are on furlough. And there's just a short list here that talks you through it. So a worker is not able to do work of any kind for your business unless they are flexibly furloughed. So if you were full-time furloughed them, they cannot come into work. They can only come in if they've been flexibly furloughed. A worker, though, can undertake training whilst they're furloughed. That is absolutely fine and is something we'd probably encourage you to do. And it's also important to notice that a worker can work elsewhere for a different employer whilst furloughed, but we would advise you to check the contract of employment before they do this, and they should let you know they're doing this, because there are clauses that organisations have in their contract which either expressly states that they cannot work for another employer whilst working for you, or that you at least have to be made aware of it. It may be something that you want to relax while you're furloughing, but it's important to check that. A worker, though, can undertake voluntary work for another employer or organisation. That is absolutely fine. And it's also important to note that if a worker's employment ends, whether that's by resignation or some form of dismissal or termination, you've got to remember that their notice pay will be likely protected from any reduction associated with the job retention scheme. So if you're only paying them 80% of their wages, you need to make sure that their notice pay is protected, and therefore seek advice on this. A final point is to remember that a worker remains employed whilst furloughed, so therefore all terms and conditions of employment, rules, policies, procedures, and everything else that they would normally have to abide by whilst they are in work still apply to them. So, holiday entitlement. This is a question that we get a lot of on the advice line about the difficulty in managing sort of ever increasing holidays whilst employees are furloughed, particularly if you've got employees who were furloughed for the first 3 months of the scheme from March through to June and then have been re-furloughed. There is a chance that they are building up quite a stash of holidays, and you need to think as a business what you can do about that and how you can manage, because when you do reopen, you're going to have to manage that holiday entitlement across multiple employees, and it needs to be viable for your business. So one option you've got is enforcing holidays. So you need to review your company policy and look at current employer guidance, but you can enforce holidays and enforce holidays during a furlough period as long as you give the employees appropriate notice. So this is twice as many days notice in advance of the first day of leave. So if you wanted someone to take 1 week leave, you would need to give them 2 weeks notice. So you need to think about this and how you fulfill that notice requirement. And then do remember that if you are enforcing holidays while someone is on furlough, that they are entitled to their full pay during this period. The other option you've got is to carry over holidays into the new year. So the government have introduced a temporary new law deal to help businesses cope with the disruption in relation to holiday accrual. And this states that employees and workers can continue to accrue leave as per their contract and can carry over up to 4 weeks paid holiday into the 2-year period upcoming. So if they can't take holidays due to COVID-19, they will be able to accrue and take over up to 4 weeks holiday, and they will use them during the next 2-year period. But this is really for businesses to make their own decision about what's right for them, whether they are just going to allow employees to store up their holidays and use them over the coming 2 years, or whether it is better that they use them in the sort of the coming months whilst they are on furlough. And do remember that the temporary law actually applies to all employees, not just those who are furloughed. So there are situations in businesses who are experiencing the opposite to needing to furlough and are extremely busy. So some of the kind of key sectors around retail, because they are so busy, employees cannot take as many holidays as they normally would because of demand. they would also be allowed to carry over the holidays for the next 2-year period. One generic question that we get quite a lot is around how do we help manage employees' expectations, because government guidance is changing so frequently. And I think we're all feeling that at the moment, that as soon as we get our heads around one piece, and I mean this from a personal point of view, as well as from a business point of view and an employment law point of view, we get our heads around one piece of new information, new regulations, new rules, and then things change again. And we get asked a lot, how can we help for businesses? How do they help their employees manage expectations with the government guidance frequently changing? I think it's important to step back and remember that all workers are different. So when you're thinking about furloughing, there's going to be a lot of different reactions to this, and you can't control those reactions, but what you can do is help to manage them. There are people who may find that furlough is the best option for them because they have care and responsibilities. Obviously, there are a lot of parents out there at the moment, and the way they're managing school breakouts is to isolate children from particular years, classes, forms, etc., for a 2-week period. People may actually feel that being on furlough is helping them manage it, but then you may get the opposite, where people who are placed on furlough are seeing this as being fearful for their job in the future. And you've just got to understand that people will feel very differently about it, and help manage those expectations. But as the government guidance changes and evolves, your business needs to keep up to date as much as it can with the restrictions and guidance that's issued. From a more pay perspective, as I said before, our team of HR experts work hard to regularly keep up to date with this, update our FAQs, update the advice we give, update our letter templates, make sure on the HR hub we've got the most up-to-date information, try and take some of that pressure away from our customers. But you still have an obligation to keep up to date with the restrictions that are being placed at a local and national level, how these restrictions may affect your organisation, how it's going to affect your workers, whether it's where they reside or where they are based in an office or their place of work, and then also how it affects them on a personal level. Today, this is particularly poignant, given that we are awaiting the details of which areas of the country are going into which tiers, and you will need to think about how that impacts you. You may have people who live in one area that is put in tier 3, for example, but their place of work is actually tier 2, or the opposite way around. How do you manage that? Think that through, and be ready to have those open conversations with your employees. Now, I think it's important to know that I don't think your employees are expecting you to have the answers to everything. That is entirely impossible at the moment, given that the ever-changing landscape. So I think it's just important to be open and honest and make sure that the employees know that they can come and ask you questions if they have any concerns. One thing that I can't stress enough, though, is that it's important to keep engaged with both your employees that are in the workplace, but also, even more importantly, your furloughed employees who are now kind of a bit more remote and detached from the business. And with them, you can agree the best course of communication with them, whether that's in a group or an individual basis. But some of the things that are really beneficial from keeping those open lines of communication and helping manage their expectation is keeping employees up to date of any changes that happen within the business, whether that's just having a weekly meeting and inviting all furloughed employees to join that weekly meeting as an update. It also helps them understand how they can stay connected and how they can raise concerns, whether it's just a simple thing of requesting holiday, reporting sickness, letting you know that they have to self-isolate, or in general where they can raise concerns. It's also an opportunity to remind them of the support available to them, whether that's training or managing their mental well-being. It's important not to forget those things whilst they're on furloughed. And then there are some organisations who are using the staying connected with furlough employees to try and arrange some kind of remote social events with colleagues, helping them feel included, less isolated. Because I think the biggest challenge we all have at the moment is that we are managing employees, organisations, alongside individuals' impact personally of what's happening with COVID. So on to the next question then. As you can imagine, another main question that we get is around redundancy, and there are some businesses who are choosing to go ahead with redundancies and make those decisions now. But when thinking about that, we've got to consider the option of furlough over redundancy. So it is arguable that by using the extended job retention scheme, that an employer could or should be able to stave off the need for redundancies whilst the scheme is in place, and that's an option available to you. And an employer who fails to do so, or at least give it serious documented consideration of that possibility, may find that in a redundancy dismissal circumstance, that it could be deemed to be unfair. Now, obviously, this is our take on this and our thoughts, as we don't know what's going to happen and how tribunals are going to view this coming forward, because this is a completely new scenario. So it isn't that you can't choose redundancy over furlough if your business decides that they need to make this choice now and that furlough is not an option. That is absolutely fine. Just make sure that you seek advice and that you document the reasons why you've made that decision, and that just strengthens your argument. But it's just important to consider furlough as an alternative to redundancy. On to the next question then. Before the announcement of this extended job retention scheme, obviously some businesses will have made decisions believing that the job retention scheme was coming to an end and they needed to make some permanent changes to their organisation design. The HMRC have confirmed that an organisation can bring an employee back if they made them redundant and place them on furlough, provided that the two following points apply. That the employee was employed on the 23rd of September 2020 and that an RTI submission was sent on or before this date, and they were made redundant or stopped working on or after the 23rd of September 2020. So if you have employees who fall into this position, you made them redundant after this date, but now consider that had you known this scheme is in place, you could have kept them on. What I would advise you to do is seek advice about your particular situation and the particular details around it from a HR professional, and then they will guide you on the best way to bring them back. But it's certainly an option that all our organisations can and should consider. So does putting an employee on furlough stop you from making them redundant? The simple answer to this is no. And if you think back to my answer on the question 2 slides ago, furlough is a consideration. Before COVID, before job retention schemes, there is always one important fact that you need to think about when you're looking at redundancies, and this is what are the alternative options to redundancy, whether this is an alternative employment, some kind of job change, some kind of different org design. You have to, as part of the process, go through what alternatives you can consider to avoid redundancy. Furlough is an extra consideration now. It is another one of those alternative considerations that you must think about, you must review, you must give serious consideration to, and you must document. So the purpose of the furlough scheme is to provide employees with an alternative to having to make compulsory redundancies if their businesses have been affected by COVID and the government restrictions. But if it is evident that there's a strong business case for redundancy, there isn't a requirement to wait until the end of the scheme before commencing a consultation process. Again, though, just seek advice before you do that. Another quite specific question that we've had, but we thought was important to put on here is, if I have issued notice to a furloughed worker, can I continue to claim from the CJRS grant while the employee is serving notice? And the answer to this is yes. So the HMRC have confirmed that employers can continue to claim for a furloughed employee who is serving statutory notice period, but only before the 1st of December. So it's an important date to note because that's not too far away now. The updated guidance on the extended furlough schemes means that after this day, employers cannot claim the furlough grant during a furloughed employee's period of contractual or statutory notice. However, the grant, you must remember that they cannot be used to substitute redundancy payments. So if you are making them redundant you can't use that to substitute. You must do the redundancy payments, and you must calculate the redundancy payments based on full pay, not the 80%. So again, these are quite intricate and detailed answers that are needed in each individual circumstance. So this gives you the overview, and the intention with all these questions is just to give you the high level overview and get you thinking about your specific instances. And it would be a case of seeking professional HR advice on how you work this out. And then sort of to finish really on the FAQs, what we've brought in is a more general question. So whether you've got employees who are currently furloughed or you're about to furlough employees and you know they will come back at some point in the future, we are asked a lot about what about staff who are frightened to return to work? What are employer rights in this? So with the ever-changing landscape and the amount of information that is out there in the media, this is having an impact on how people feel personally about returning to work. So in the first instance, I would say that it's important to understand what those concerns are. So if you have somebody who's been furloughed and you want to bring them back into the workplace and they are refusing to do so out of fear, you need to understand what that fear is. You can mitigate the risk by ensuring that you have followed all the advice about COVID safe and secure workplaces and that you have things in place. But the truth is that there will be some employees out there who believe they are in serious or imminent circumstances of danger, wanting to refuse to return to the place of work. If an employee was dismissed because of these circumstances, they could make a claim for automatic unfair dismissal. And as I said, though, you can really mitigate that with the COVID-19 workplace rights and risks, safeguards and policies, and making sure that you've got everything in place. If despite your best efforts though, and I would take this one step at a time and get advice along the way, because you will have to understand why that individual and what is it about their circumstances that is meaning they are refusing to return to work. If after all the best efforts, then there are some options. You can agree for them to remain furloughed if you feel like there's a best option. You can offer for them to take annual leave if they've got some untaken. And of course, we understand that that might not last for the whole duration of the period. It may be that they move to unpaid leave, or you could just offer for them to take unpaid leave for the next few months. But the final option is that you could go down the disciplinary route. Now, although I mentioned at the beginning of this question that could be quite risky because they could make a claim for automatic unfair dismissal, there are lots of things that you can put in place to prove why that is not unfair if they are just refusing to return to work and you do not believe that there is a genuine reason and that you've done everything you can to mitigate that. But in that circumstances, please do not make that decision without taking some professional HR advice before you do that. But as I said, this is quite a common question that we get. And in most cases, our teams have been able to step by step help businesses with this kind of query, and in most cases there is a positive outcome without the need to even consider going down the disciplinary route. There are lots of things that we can help put in place from both our HR and our health and safety team, and I would imagine that that's the case in most instances around businesses, but there will be some where these are more particularly difficult, so always take advice.
Thank you, Michelle.
Okay.
That was great. So
no
we've come to the section on the live Q&A. So obviously it's your chance to ask some questions. We have had lots through, but continue to drop them into the question box as we go, and we'll cover off what we can. So first question from Lynn. One of our employees has been put on flexible furlough, but has been lucky to work all of the time. He has booked some holiday in December. Can this be furlough and 80% claimed from the government?
That's quite a tricky one, and I'd probably need to take a step back and review in more detail. If they have been furloughed but they've been working, that sort of means they've not really been furloughed. So there is a risk that if you place them on furlough just while they were on annual leave, that it would look that wouldn't look good if you were audited. What we'd have to do is see details of where they have been furloughed, how long they were furloughed for, because in general, whilst someone's furloughed and you give them holidays, you can continue to claim, but we'd need to look at that in more detail. So what I will commit to doing is taking that question away, trying to look at the specifics in more detail, and then either myself or one of our team will come back with a definitive answer on it, if that's okay.
Yeah, sounds good. We have had quite a specific payroll question as well from Paulina. So Paulina, we'll come back to you on that one because it's a very good question about payroll. So we'll get one of our payroll experts to come back to you on that one. We've had a question again on flexible furlough, and this one's from Jill. So when flexi furlough hours alter or change, do you need to gain a further agreement?
I think you can do an overall agreement, but you would need to make sure that overall agreement allowed you some form of flexibility. So if during the flexible furlough you are going to change on a weekly basis, you do have two options. You can either on a weekly basis rewrite them and say, this is what we're going to be doing this week, and agree that in advance. And this can just be a short 1-paragraph letter that's an addition. If you wanted to get an agreement up front that covered you for changing or flexible an approach to this where each week will be different, then you'd need to word that letter in a different way. It is entirely possible, but I'd again seek advice on the exact wording of that letter. And at MorePay we have numerous letter templates available, and our advisors can look over those letter templates before they go out to make sure that they're okay.
Yeah. A question from Stephanie. So she's asked, we shut our charity between Christmas and New Year. No one works, but they don't have to take annual leave. They're given, and she's used the term contracted given days. Do we need to top these up to 100% as we would if annual leave was taken?
Yes, you would do. Any type of annual leave or where they are given, so it's a given, even if it's not written in the contract, you are custom and practice giving them, say it's the 3 days between Christmas and New Year, they would need to be paid at 100%.
A question from Helen. If we have had someone flexibly furloughed, can we reduce the amount of time furloughed by having an employee do a second, i.e. part-time role in the company? So she's given an example. An employee does 2 days in their substantive role, 2 days in a second role in the company, and 1 day on furlough.
Yeah, that would be fine if you decide that there are alternative duties that you want that employee to do. And that works for your business, that's absolutely fine. Just make sure that you document it in writing and it is communicated and agreed with the employee. I think at the moment all businesses are just looking at how best they can operate in the circumstances. You know, we hear of businesses where they've got directors in at a weekend packing orders because they usually have agency staffing over Christmas, but are able to afford that, or two, they can't have any more people in because of the COVID safe restrictions. So there are lots of examples of where businesses are being a lot more flexible about the roles that people do. But as always, would advise you to document that in writing with the employee to ensure that there's a record that they agreed to that.
Yeah. A good question from Jenny here. So with regard to resignation and pay, if a colleague is furloughed and then they resign, does this mean we need to ensure they are paid 100% pay, but can use the 80% furlough and top this up?
Yeah, that's a little bit of a tricky one. And again, I may need to come back on this because this is changing so frequently. the rules are kind of do keep being different. But if I think I've understood the question right, that just repeat that again.
So
It's quite specific.
so I think she's asking, so if somebody's been furloughed but then they resign, how does that work in terms of their pay? You know, can they use that furlough scheme up until that point? And you know, and claim that 80%? I'm assuming yes.
Yes, I am assuming that they can do. I'm just looking back at there's a date around the 1st of December though.
Yeah.
If you just forgive me, I'm just looking back through to make sure I get the exact thing. Just bear with me 2 seconds.
Yeah. And she just wanted to know if you know, they need to ensure that they're paid the 100%, which I would assume.
Here we go. Yeah, just bear with me. I've got the thing up here.
Good question, Jenny.
Yeah, the information that we've got at the moment is that the HMRC have confirmed that employers can continue to claim for a furloughed employee who is serving statutory notice period, but only before the 1st of December. And the updated guidance on the extended furlough scheme means that after this date, employers cannot claim the furlough grant during a furloughed employee's period of contractual or statutory notice. What I'd need to double check is whether that just relates to organisations giving their notice or whether that also relates to individuals giving their notice. So again, we will come back with a definitive answer. I think because the rules have changed so recently and we're still gathering all the information, it's best in these circumstances to give you the initial answer, but then make sure that we come back with the full and final answer to ensure that we've got the absolute right information in your particular instance. And that's why I'm hesitant. And I just think that's the best way to do it at the moment.
Okey-doke. A question from Keith. Can we furlough over the Christmas and New Year period?
Yes, there is no restrictions over Christmas and New Year. It is just as it was before, and you need to make the right decisions according to your business needs.
Question from Gary. What about furlough leading into a maternity? And how do you move over to maternity, or can you leave them furloughed until the end of March?
It would always be advisable to move them over to maternity leave, because once they have had the baby, they should be on maternity leave, and there are specific rules around maternity leave and what needs to be taken after a woman has given birth. So again, seek advice on it, but you can furlough an employee in the run up to maternity leave, but just make sure that you seek specific advice on how to calculate their average earnings, because they cannot suffer a detriment because they were on 80% because of furlough. So that's quite a specific calculation. You would need to go back to work out what 100% would be. So that would be something you'd need to work with your payroll department, your payroll provider, alongside HR advice. But it's important to remember that they should not suffer a detriment.
Yeah. Question from a different Gary. Can a person who is furloughed for another company work for you if you work in the same industry?
Yeah, there aren't any restrictions, as I said before, on people taking up another role whilst they are furloughed, as long as their contract of employment allows it. So they need to go back to their original contract and look at what restrictions are in there. And they also need to make sure that it doesn't interfere with their primary employer and their needs. With their flexible furloughed and they are required to be in the workplace for a certain amount of time, that needs to be given priority over any secondary job. But the government have laid it out so that they are not stopping people going and getting another job. There were lots of examples during the first period of furloughing, say people in the hospitality industry who had been furloughed, getting jobs as delivery drivers for well-known supermarkets. So things like that can still continue, and the government are encouraging people to do what they need to do, but make sure you check the contract of employment, and that primary employer should take precedent.
Yeah, Okey-doke. I know that we've got lots of great questions here. I figured we would do. So we've got one from Lizzie. So they've got an employee who is part furloughed on a 4-day working week with 1 day as furlough. So basically Monday to Thursday is 100% working, they cover the wages, and the Friday is the furlough day. She'd like to know, is the government contribution affected by how that Monday to Thursday is recorded? So if this person is doing actual working days, or if they're on annual leave days, does that impact that Friday furlough?
No, it shouldn't do. If that Friday furlough is still a furlough day and not an annual leave day, then it shouldn't affect it. I would say that if it's annual leave, though, that Friday, you'd obviously have to top it up to 100%. But if there's anything more specific that they need to ask, then they should seek advice on it.
Yeah. An excellent question here from Lynn. How do we select employees for furlough where we have a number of people in the same role, but we only need a smaller number of them due to the COVID impact? How do we go about choosing who's on furlough and who's not?
Yeah, this is a question that we obviously got asked a lot back in March when furlough first came into effect. And the simplest answer is that if you thought about it in the same way that you do a redundancy situation, but with certainly a lot less kind of rigor around it, you need to look at that pool of people that you have got available and come up with a way of deciding who it is that you need. There are a number of different ways that you can do this. One is you making that decision and deciding who's got the right skills, is in the right location, who's got the most experience. They're all things that you can use: length of service, qualifications, even down to kind of performance ratings. You could use those, and that's why I've kind of likened it to a very slimmed down version of a redundancy selection process. I would be honest and open with the individuals, or you may find that you decide you want to ask the individuals themselves, and there may be some people who want to voluntarily put themselves forward for furlough. As I said before, there might be some kind of care responsibilities that they've got, which will actually make, and furlough would make their life easier. That is one option. The most important thing to do is to be open and honest with the employees about why and how you are doing it, and to also have some documentation. So if further down the line there was never an employment tribunal that came about, that you had some documented evidence over why you'd chosen one person over another. And it's also important to remember that if a furlough situation ever did lead to a redundancy further down the line from that same pool of people, that you don't use being on furlough as one of the criteria.
Excellent. We are running out of time, so we'll do one more question and then we will have to wrap things up. We've had a couple of quite long and detailed questions come through as well. If you are a MorePay customer, just obviously pick up the phone to your account manager and have a chat with them. But one more question. So this is from Jenny. An employee who is 72 has said she is unable to come back to the office, although she was asked to do so just 1 day per week. Therefore, she has resigned. What are the risks?
There are risks if you have not looked at all possible alternatives of possibly age discrimination, and then depending on the reason that she is saying she can't come back, if it's related to a long-term health issue, there is a potential risk of disability discrimination. Because the individual has resigned, obviously that's not something you've imposed on them, but with resignation can come the risk of constructive dismissal. This is quite a new area of employment law, one that's obviously not been tested, where someone feels they have no option but to resign because of COVID-19. This isn't tried and tested in case law. What I would suggest doing is, if you're a MorePay customer, pick up the phone to the HR advice line, or speak to your internal HR team to see if there's anything that you need to retrospectively do to make sure that you can demonstrate the process that you followed in helping them to think about coming back to work, and that they felt the environment was safe. And it could just be at the end of all that, you've done everything you possibly could, and this individual has just made a life choice and said, this is the time for me to finish. given the risks that are going on, and there's absolutely no comeback from it, but you need to be prepared in case there was.
Yeah. Thanks, Michelle. So for the questions that we didn't get to, I think because we've had so many good ones and we've had a couple of requests from people to have answers to other people's questions, we'll do our best to kind of collate them all and either come back to you on email or maybe even put them in a blog post, because I do think it would be useful to share the answers. So just to wrap things up, we have got a couple of resources that might be of use. So if you're looking specifically at the payroll implications on furlough over the sort of coming Christmas period, we have just updated our payroll at Christmas guide, which is available in our Knowledge Centre, obviously free to download. So if that's useful, go and have a look. We've also got an upcoming webinar that is on absence management and also taking a look at bringing employees back from furlough. That's going to be on the 15th of next month. So I'll include an invite to that on our webinar follow-up. So if it's of interest, obviously feel free to sign up. Finally, just to wrap things up, I do plug our Knowledge Centre on every webinar, but just because it is so useful, we've got lots and lots of useful resources on there. Old webinar recordings that are still very relevant, lots of blog posts and guides. So go and have a look on the MorePay website and take a look around. And you know, as mentioned, everything on there is free to download. So hopefully you'll find that useful. So thank you so much for joining today. Big thank you to Michelle for hosting and for answering as many questions as she could. Really appreciate it as always, Michelle. And yeah, we hope you found it useful. We'll follow up with the slides very, very soon, as well as a recording. We hope you enjoy the rest of your day. We'll close the webinar now. Thanks, guys.